is precisely that. And I've kind of sampled it with some folks that I think would fit in the category that you've accurately identified. And those people are saying, well, it was tough in a few places, but I hung in there and I got a lot out of it, especially in the other parts of the book, but I even got something in those harder places. So yeah, I do think it's accessible.
Well, it was nice, too, as I was reading through it. You warned us as that was coming. You warned and you said these next couple of chapters will be a little bit more difficult, but just hang with us, and that helps. That is always helpful. So thank you for doing that. At the very beginning of the book, and I just want to jump right into this first half, speaking about the worldviews, you had a kind of something new to me in the terminology whenever you said there are two different types of worldviews in general, and you said there's a thick worldview and a thin worldview. Can you tell me the difference between thick and thin worldviews?
Yeah, this is so important for people to carry this around with them, this distinction between a thick and a thin worldview. A thin worldview is a worldview that takes the world to be a certain kind of place. And when that worldview describes the world, it doesn't have any room for there being anything that really matters. So a thin worldview would describe the world as just, let's just say, composed of matter. We were not put here for a purpose. People don't have free will, so they're not responsible for their choices. There's no life after death. There's no objective difference between right and wrong, nothing really has value in and of itself. This would be the kind of worldview that Richard Dawkins is promoting, and he very clearly states that he doesn't know what it means to talk about real good and evil. So a thin worldview would be a world in which everything's ultimately meaningless. I take conservative forms of Buddhism to be thin worldviews because everything is ultimately nothingness. A thick worldview would be a worldview that depicts the world in such a way that human action and human beings and human life matters. So that the Muslim worldview, even though it's false, it would be a thick worldview in the sense I mean it. And of course, the only true and clearly the most reasonable thick worldview is a Christian worldview. The reason this is important, and I'll give it back to you, is that a lot of times we find secular people who espouse a secular worldview, but who are acting like the world is thick. And what they're doing is borrowing capital from a Christian worldview, and we have to call them on that. We need to ask people to be consistent with their worldview instead of acting like things really matter. You know, like why would Dawkins waste time writing a book as though it matters for him to expose the God delusion if nothing matters? Why not just parlor games? And so Dawkins is actually giving evidence that he knows better, and that's why the difference is important.
That was such a strong point in the book, too, that you emphasize quite often. And for those of you out there, that is just something, as he said, to grab a hold of and to understand. And it is very well done in your book, the differences between this thick and worldview. But I also had this question down here, because you say this quite often. You say that Western society is living off of borrowed capitalism of a Judeo-Christian worldview, and the loan is past due. I like that. That was good. The loan is past due. Now, I know you've already given one example of Dawkins and him living seemingly very inconsistently within his thin worldview. What are some other ways in which people live this thin worldview out? Some other kind of down-home illustrations that we can see.
Yeah, I've got a really good one for you. I mentioned it in the book, but I can elaborate on it. Elizabeth Vargas filled in for Peter Jennings on the ABC Evening News when Jennings was dying of cancer. She did the Person of the Week, which ABC does every Friday, and they celebrated for the Person of the Week that week a man in Atlanta, Georgia, who has a theater for handicapped people. He only allows handicapped people to audition for roles in his plays, and then so that the actors are all handicapped, and it's been a tremendous success. And they asked him, why has this been such a success? And he said, well, for a short period of time, these handicapped people feel like they're a part of something bigger and more important than they are. Now, Elizabeth Vargas may be coming back to her Christian faith. I've heard this, but never mind. What gets on that show is not her decision anyway, and she's part of a profession, the media, that is overwhelmingly secular. And if you're secular, there's no justification for celebrating caring for handicapped people. In fact, it would make more sense in a Darwinian naturalist view of the world to sterilize these people so they can't have children and pollute the gene pool, or to exterminate them. Now, this is not hypothetical. From 1905 until about the late 1920s, there was a movement in the United States called the eugenics movement, and it was a movement precisely designed to get the 48 states to sign legislation that would require the sterilization of people that were immoral or alcoholics or mentally handicapped or heavily depressed or bipolar and so on. The state of Ohio, 30 states passed eugenics legislation. For example, the state of Ohio, the police found a woman who had committed adultery on her husband and with her, in spite of her children, and they sterilized her. Now, the state of California led the way of all the states in pushing eugenics legislation. In fact, the state of California was so severe on this that when the Nazis looked for material to justify eugenics on the Jews, they used some of the minutes of the state legislature's meetings in California to justify their propaganda. The reason California was at the front edge of this is it was the most secular state, and the eugenics movement was an expression consciously of Darwinian naturalism. It was the church, particularly Louisiana, where the Catholic Church overtook the legislature and persuaded them that everyone's made in the image of God, no matter how handicapped they are. And eventually, it was the biblical concept of the image of God that was able to put at bay the eugenics movement. Here's my point. If ABC News and these other news are constantly going to represent religion as superstitious and pretend that the scientists are the authorities on everything, and Darwinian naturalism is really the only worldview that makes any sense, but you can believe in God if you have that sort of a need, then they can't be celebrating someone who is caring for handicapped people as though he's really doing something important. As a matter of fact, the case has already been made that he ought to be sterilizing those people. And by the way, if naturalism is true, why not have the dog of the week instead of the person of the week? Isn't it a little bit racist to pick a person? So there's an example of where if you would read the Kingdom Triangle or some other book that helps you think about worldview, you don't just sit there listening to the evening news. You also are wondering, what kind of worldview assumptions is this reporter making, and how could I as a Christian point out the inconsistencies? That's what I'm talking.
Very good. Dog of the week rather than the person of the week. That is living consistently according to a thin worldview, but a thick worldview would say, well, there is value within people, and therefore we can have a people of the week. Now, whenever I think of this, and whenever most people are out there looking at this, they may say this: okay, I'm a Christian, and there's non-Christians. There's the religious Christians, and then there's the secular. You talk about in your book really breaking up these major overarching philosophies of secularism into two different areas. You've got our worldview, which is ethical monotheism, is what you call it here. And then you've also got postmodernism and naturalism. Can you explain those three and the differences? Ethical, monotheism, postmodernism, and naturalism.
Sure, Michael. There was a newspaper article in the Seattle Times on the editorial page a few years back that said America is the most divided nation in its history since the Civil War, and that division is largely not one of political party, but it's even deeper, it's worldview, and which I agreed with. And he went on to say that the worldview difference is largely between those who believe that we are the created product of a good God who is transcendent. He's the source of value. He is the source of the moral law. We owe our due to him. The family is not an arbitrary creation of evolution. It is something God gave to us.